The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the fences, not the guards, not even the snow packed hard against the road like frozen ash. It was the smell drifting across the field from somewhere beyond the trees, warm and impossible, thick with wood smoke and bread and something sweet they could not immediately name. Several of the German prisoners lifted their heads at once, almost embarrassed by the movement, as though hunger itself had become shameful. Their boots dragged through the snow in uneven rhythm while the American truck disappeared behind them down the road, its engine fading into the white distance. One of the younger prisoners whispered something under his breath. Another answered with a dry laugh that ended quickly in the cold air. No one wanted to waste warmth speaking. The guards marched them through a narrow gate beside a frozen pasture where black cattle stood motionless beneath a pale sky. Beyond it sat the farmhouse, weathered and crooked, with thin smoke curling steadily from the chimney. It did not look important. That was what unsettled them. Important places had hard edges, barracks, rail stations, factories, places designed for commands. This place looked lived in. A child's sled leaned against the porch rail, half buried in snow. A lantern glowed behind one curtain. Somewhere nearby, unseen chickens made restless sounds beneath a wooden coop. One of the prisoners, an older mechanic named Dieter, stared at the sled for a long moment before lowering his eyes again. "Feels wrong," he muttered quietly. The guard nearest him glanced over but said nothing. They were led toward the barn first, where steam drifted from the animals in soft clouds, and the smell of hay settled thick in the lungs. Warmth hit them slowly, not enough to comfort, just enough to remind the body what it had lost. Several prisoners stood motionless beside the entrance longer than necessary, absorbing it in silence. A farmer appeared from behind a stack of feed sacks, broad-shouldered, grey-haired, wearing thick gloves darkened with soil and grease. He looked at the prisoners the way a tired man looks at weather, not angry, not welcoming either, simply accepting that it had arrived. "Need hands for the fence line," he told the guards. Storm knocked half of it down. His voice carried no drama, no triumph. One of the younger prisoners blinked at the simplicity of it. Back home, guards shouted, officers barked, men disappeared for speaking too slowly. Here, a farmer discussed broken fences while snow melted from their boots onto the barn floor. The absurdity of it lingered, like a strange taste in the mouth. They worked until dusk, beneath a sky fading from white into iron grey. Frozen posts had to be dug out and reset while wind moved across the open field in sharp, restless bursts. Fingers stiffened despite the gloves they had been given. A few of the men exchanged wary looks over that detail alone. Gloves. Real wool-lined gloves. One prisoner inspected his pair twice, suspicious there must be some condition attached, but no condition came. The farmer merely pointed toward the damaged fence and continued working alongside them in silence. By evening, the younger prisoners were exhausted enough to forget caution. One of them stumbled while carrying wire and cursed loudly in German. To his shock, the farmer laughed, just once, short and tired. "Wire bites everybody," he said. The prisoner stared as if uncertain whether he had understood correctly. Later, when darkness swallowed the field and the temperature dropped harder still, they were led toward the farmhouse porch, where pale yellow light spilled across the snow. The smell returned stronger now, bread, potatoes, meat simmering in gravy. The prisoners slowed instinctively. A guard opened the door and warm air rushed over them all at once, thick with heat and cooking smoke and something else almost unbearable in its familiarity. Cinnamon. One of the younger men closed his eyes briefly, just for a second. Inside, the kitchen glowed with lamplight reflected against old wooden walls. A woman stood near the stove, drying her hands on a cloth towel. She looked neither frightened nor stern, simply tired in the deep, permanent way war had made so many people tired. She studied the prisoners quietly, while the farmer removed his gloves beside the door. No one spoke at first. Then she nodded toward the long table. "Sit before it gets cold." The prisoners hesitated. Dieter remained standing longest. "Why?" he asked finally. The woman looked confused by the question itself. "Because you're hungry," she answered. Silence followed that. Heavy silence. The kind that forces men to look away from one another. They sat slowly, awkwardly, steam rising from their coats while bowls were placed before them, one by one. Thick stew, dark bread, butter soft enough to spread. One prisoner stared at the butter as though it were some kind of hallucination. Another touched the edge of the bowl carefully, testing whether the heat was real. No one ate immediately. Suspicion held them still. The woman noticed. "It's not poisoned," she said softly, almost amused. A few guards laughed under their breath. Then one of the youngest prisoners lifted a spoon with trembling fingers and tasted the broth. His expression changed before he could hide it. Not joy exactly. Something smaller, more dangerous. Memory. Around the table, spoons finally began moving, quietly at first, then faster. Steam clouded the windows while outside the wind scraped across the dark, frozen fields. The farmer ate beside them without speaking much. Occasionally the woman refilled a bowl before anyone asked. Each time she did, several prisoners stiffened with visible discomfort. Kindness had become harder to understand than cruelty. Cruelty, at least, followed rules. Halfway through the meal, one prisoner stopped eating entirely. He was staring at the loaf of bread near the center of the table. "My mother baked bread like this," he whispered. No one answered him. The woman heard anyway. She looked down briefly at her hands. "Most mothers did," she said. Something changed after that. Not forgiveness, nothing so large. But the room grew quieter in a different way, as if everyone present had suddenly remembered lives existing beyond uniforms and borders and maps. The younger prisoner beside the stove laughed softly at something one guard muttered about frozen fence posts, and for a moment the sound resembled an ordinary winter supper somewhere untouched by war. That was the unsettling part, not the food, not the warmth, the normalcy of it. Later, when the meal ended and the prisoners prepared to return to the barn loft where they would sleep, several of them lingered near the doorway, uncertainly. The woman disappeared into another room without explanation. One guard reached for his coat. Chairs creaked softly against the wooden floor. Outside, wind pressed snow against the porch steps in thin, restless sheets. Then the woman returned carrying a bundle in both arms, scarves, thick socks, worn gloves patched carefully at the fingertips. She crossed the room and placed them onto the table without ceremony. "Take these too," she said. The prisoners froze. No one moved. One of the younger men stared at the pile as though afraid touching it would break some invisible rule. Dieter looked toward the farmer suspiciously. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. The farmer leaned back against the wall, tired eyes fixed on the dark window beside him. "Because cold doesn't care whose side you've fought on." No one spoke after that. The silence stretched long enough for the stove to crack softly beneath its own heat. One prisoner removed his glasses and wiped his eyes quickly before anyone noticed. Another reached toward the scarves with slow, uncertain fingers, almost reverent. The woman adjusted the lantern wick without looking directly at them. Perhaps that was her kindness too, pretending not to see what war had done to grown men. Outside, snow continued falling over the fields and fences and roads disappearing into darkness. It covered everything evenly. The prisoners climbed the ladder into the hayloft later that night, carrying blankets that still held traces of wood smoke from the farmhouse below. Wind rattled the barn walls gently, while animals shifted in their stalls beneath them. No one slept immediately. They lay staring upward at the old wooden beams overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, one man whispered, "I don't understand these people." Another answered after a long pause, "Maybe that's the point." The younger prisoner, who had spoken little all evening, pulled the borrowed scarf tighter around his neck. It smelled faintly of soap and cinnamon. He thought suddenly of his mother hanging laundry behind their apartment before the war, steam rising from the kitchen window into cold morning air. The memory hurt more than hunger ever had. Yet he held on to it anyway, because for the first time in months the memory no longer felt like something dying. Down below, the farmhouse light finally went dark. The fields outside disappeared beneath fresh snow. Fences became white lines dissolving into shadow. Borders looked smaller at night, almost imaginary, and somewhere between the cold barn air and the lingering warmth trapped inside the borrowed wool, several exhausted men realized something they would carry long after the war itself ended. Sometimes mercy arrived so quietly it felt unbearable. Not because it erased suffering, but because it reminded people they were still human enough to feel it.